months. So first and foremost, we'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East and the Levant, the war between Israel and Hamas, its local, regional, and global consequences, and the interplay of powers in the region. So in fact, this is really the round table that's in touch with the hottest and most direct news. And if you're a bit late, we'll leave you another 5 minutes to either find a place to stand or sit where you can, or there's an encore room next door where you can watch and follow this round table on video and ask your questions and answers. So you can have, for technical reasons too, can we please have the lights just a little lower down? Because right now they're in your eyes and it's pretty unpleasant. No? Yes, a little more? No, what you wrote.
No, I didn't see what you wrote. Is this a microphone? I'm not trying to express myself like an interpreter, but it's a specific job. It's no problem. No, I don't have a problem because I don't have many questions about the archives.
So,
yes, and I sent it exactly, but I don't know how. No, because I sent it all quickly. All right then, in 5 minutes.
It's very complicated what you've done.
I'd like to remind you that if you haven't already done so, if you want to ask questions, you can scan the QR code on the posters that are everywhere, and in particular here, and log on to this Slido application. Then click on the Colbert Room, and you'll be in live contact with our media team, and in any case, with the people who are doing and who will show them to us in the second half, who will show them to us on the screen. I'd like to remind you that you can ask your questions directly on your smartphone, which, given that there are so many of you, because there are still a lot of people in the other room, will enable us current events. Before I say a few words about the modus operandi of our debates, I'm pleased to introduce our 4 panelists, all of whom are very, how shall I put it? They're all very up-to-date and very knowledgeable about the situation in the Levant and the Middle East. First of all, it's a real pleasure to welcome Nomi Baryakov, who is here and who is an associate researcher in the International Security Program at Chatham House in London. Nomi and I have known each other for a number of years. She's multilingual and knows the Middle East really well as it's part of her job. She has held various positions in the Department of Political Affairs and the Executive Office of the Secretary General at the United Nations headquarters in New York. She is very present in the Anglo-Saxon media, particularly at the moment with the war between Israel and Hamas, but also more generally on conflicts in the Middle East. She has, of course, published numerous studies and remains deeply committed to finding a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She will speak to us about this in a moment. On my left, I'm also delighted to welcome Dorothee Schmidt, whom I've known for several years, who is in charge of the Contemporary Turkey and Middle East program at IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations in Paris. She is a specialist in Mediterranean and Turkish issues. She holds a degree from Sciences Po Paris, a DESS in Applied Economics, and a doctorate in Political Science from Paris E, Panthéon, Sorbonne. She has published numerous studies. She's renowned and well-known. Everyone recognizes her as one of the leading experts on Turkey and France. In fact, she has just published La Turquie en 100 questions, published by Editions Talendier. I'm also pleased to introduce Hasan Yükselen, Director of Security and Strategic Studies at the Foreign Policy Institute in Ankara, Turkey's TFPI, who previously had a distinguished military career in the Turkish army, most recently as advisor to the head of the intelligence division of the Turkish General Staff until the year 2002. He is an expert on regional issues who knows the terrain well and has published numerous articles, including a recent one in which he takes stock of 100 years of Turkish foreign policy. So he'll tell us a little bit about it, and he's particularly well qualified to help us decipher the fundamentals of Turkey's strategic posture and its very recent foreign policy developments. I hope this is well translated. And thanks again to Hasan for being with us. And finally, Marc Semo, journalist, historian, joined Liberation as vice president in September 2008. Marc Semo became a major reporter in the year 189, which led him to cover numerous conflicts, including those in the Middle East. He knows the region well, having traveled in all directions, including Turkey. In 2010, he became international editor-in-chief at Libération before joining the daily Le Monde in 2016 to cover diplomatic news, then to co-host the paper's ID debate pages, which he still does today, writing regular columns on international current affairs. As Pascal Hosser said earlier, this session is a debate session. I would just like to remind you that our discussions are not intended to be a forum for one side or the other. On the contrary, we're going to try to put our expertise and our different perspectives on the region to your advantage, and this gives me the opportunity to say to the interpreters and to all of you, I'll be speaking mainly in French, but when I ask questions directly to our two English-speaking panelists, I'll ask them directly in English. Everyone speaks their own language. Everyone answers in their own language. So for those who need a translation device, don't hesitate to tune in because we'll be alternating the two languages a little. To begin, since we have an hour and a half, I'd like to ask you all, and I'll start by asking Marc Semo, how you analyze the strategies of the protagonists and belligerents in the war between Israel and Hamas, that is, as of today, November 9th. In your opinion, what are the strategies of Israel and Hamas today? Is there a strategy My understanding is that Israel is fighting somewhere on three fronts. The first is the battlefield, obviously, trying to avoid escalation of this battlefield to other internal Israeli fronts or external fronts with Lebanon. A second shall we say, field is that of media warfare and communication, with the absolute necessity for Israel to retain the support of the United States at all costs. And a third front, which is perhaps more related to the fact that the Israeli army and security authorities somewhere want to make up for their shortcomings at the start of this war on October 7th and 8th, and therefore somewhere are trying to make up for them and convince the Israelis that they are there to ensure their long-term security. So to begin with, I'll hand over to Mark, and of course, after that, we'll rotate the floor. We're going to talk for about 50 minutes because we have a number of questions to answer and a lot of things to tell you. After that, you'll have about 35 minutes to ask your questions, and then we'll debate with you.
Thank you, Pierre. So I think you've pretty much summed up Israel's strategy. First of all, we can ask ourselves whether there is a strategy not for the immediate future, but a strategy for the future. That's obvious. For the moment, it's not clear what the Israeli authorities want to do. For the time being, the strategy is obviously to annihilate, if not Hamas, at least its military structures. But this is a very high-risk equation, as everyone can see. In the context of an overpopulated Gaza Strip, where any large-scale operation necessarily involves collateral damage. In this case, the toll is still terrible. 10,000 more deaths among Palestinian civilians than in any previous intervention in Gaza. And growing pressure from world public opinion, and therefore from Israel's allies, including the United States, which have Israel's legitimate right to defend itself, so that at the very least there can be pauses or even a ceasefire, if not ultimately a solution. So what we need to understand, and I'll just pick up on what Pierre said, is that this is a war unlike any other, different from all the others there are. Israeli-Palestinian, that is in the years 77 and 73, and different from other operations in Gaza. Why is this so? Because of the very specific, particularly atrocious nature of the massacres committed by Hamas, on October 7th, both because it targeted the very territory of the State of Israel in depth, and because it was aimed exclusively, well, not exclusively, but it was aimed at least as much at civilians as at soldiers, with massacres under horrific conditions. People who were killed simply for being Jewish or presumed to be Jewish, because there were also Thai workers, including Arab workers in Israel, who were killed in these attacks. And so, for the Israelis, what happened was the Nazis. Admittedly, this was the biggest massacre of Jews in the world since the Holocaust, with around 1,400 dead in a single day, an unparalleled toll. So Israel's response is obviously different. It's no longer an existential threat, as 77 or 73 might have been, but a different kind of existential threat. That's the very reason, in the eyes of the Israeli authorities and the Israeli population, of Israel's existence is called into question, since Israel was supposed to offer protection to Jews all over the world. So in this operation, the army and security forces have no room for error, and they can only make mistakes. And we're already seeing this in the information war being waged around the operations. The other part of this war is Hamas. So what does Hamas want? So obviously, as in everything, and I'll end on this note, as in any asymmetrical conflict, the important thing is to last as long as possible. And that's what they're going to try to do. Then there's the question of what sense the October 7th operation made to Hamas. If Hamas had confined itself to launching attacks on military bases, kidnapping soldiers, the situation would probably have been rather different, because it could have said, well, obviously Israel would have denounced the terrorism, but it would have been a military operation that puts the Palestinian question back at the center of the game, that gives Hamas the stature of standard bearer for the Palestinian question. We can ask ourselves why the massacres and atrocities took place, and above all, what Hamas did to broadcast these images everywhere. Hamas was the first to broadcast these images. So why did they do it? Did they want to set a trap for Israel by forcing them into a sixth reaction on Gaza? Was it something that must somehow slip out of their hands? These are open questions.
Mark, thank you very much. Nomi, what are your own views?
What are your views on Israel's strategy, and from what you understand, not forgetting, of course, Hamas's strategy? And what would you like to say more generally?
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me and letting me be heard. The debate is important, and it's essential that we will have a peaceful procedure or process in a democratic, reliable way, with the possibility for both sides to reflect on what needs to be done between now and the end of this war. In terms of strategy, we're going to have to see whether there's a lot of diplomatic effort that's going to be needed to make sure that there's a way out. Because the other way out, which is the escalation of the war, is not acceptable. The Israelis have organized press conferences with the media, and they have made it clear that their point of view is quite clear, and especially as far as Hamas's point of view is concerned, they are getting closer to Gaza, and they are updating the information from time to time. That's their current immediate goal. And for strategy, Hamas has already said that this point of view won't be about talking about a massacre. Quite simply, it's just the start of another much longer journey with more massacres, not to mention possibly hostage-taking. As Mark said, most of these people are civilians with small children and mothers and children who love their parents, as well as elderly people who are sick and in their 80s, who live around Gaza. And it's absurd for some people to get to this stage, especially on the Israeli side. So the Israelis are quite clear about their objectives. And there will undoubtedly be an end to the military thrust or actions in the near future. Meanwhile, on the Palestinian side, there have been enormous losses. About a third of the houses in northern Gaza have been destroyed, meaning that people have been forced to flee southwards and may not even have a home after all this. Once the Israelis are gone, it certainly won't be the Israelis who stay there. And then there's a lot of practical planning to be done too, with a key role to be played by the Arab states. First of all, so that the Palestinians to decide. There are a lot of problems on the West Bank and especially in Gaza. It's not the fact that 10,000 people have lost their lives. It's the fact that it's going to go on for a long time, I think. And there's a lot things to say afterwards. Thank you, Naomi. I'll now hand over to Dorothy. Thank you, Naomi.
I wasn't going to put my sunglasses back on because we're back to full speed.
If we could lower the lights a little, like we did earlier, because we can't do it now, please.
Thank you, Pierre. So the question for us is, what is Hamas's strategy? What is Israel's strategy at this stage? First, a quick word. We thought we'd be coming to a round table, talking about the Eastern Mediterranean more generally. I'm involved in a track tour where we were about to propose an initiative to institutionalize a platform for peace in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we were hit by this episode of war just when we thought we'd really cleared the ground. So it's something that concerns all of us as canalists or as people in charge, because we thought we were in a moment of deconfliction in the Middle East, and now we realize that this conflict, which had been somewhat forgotten or swept under the carpet, is coming back. And so my first point of response concerns Hamas's strategy. In my opinion, it's really a strategy of escalation. First of all, it's a war, and I don't think we should be talking about cleanup operations in Gaza. I think Hamas's real aim is to wage war on Israel, to present itself as the military force that can revive the logic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or even the Israeli-Arab conflict, because I think the idea is really to put the conflict back at the top of the list of priorities. Whereas since the Arab Spring, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has actually fallen down the list of regional conflicts. So to take advantage of this moment of deconfliction I was talking about, with a certain appeasement in Syria, the reintegration of Bashar al-Assad into the Arab League, the preliminary agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the Abraham Accords, obviously for the integration of Israel into the region. The idea here, on the contrary, is to show that once again a war is possible and that it could be extended. I imagine we'll be talking about the possibility of escalation or widening of the conflict. At this stage, I'd like to say that we're all thinking in real time, obviously, with the data we have on a conflict that is extremely complex, because it involves not just the participants in the region, but the whole world, including our own societies, and we can see the repercussions of this social conflict. There's one thing that seems important to me about Iran, which has been singled out as possibly the prime culprit in the Hamas attack, or as the first actor who might have an interest in escalation. I think Iran practically won the war in Syria, so I don't think it's in any mood today to reignite conflicts, and not this one. So I think we'll have to talk about that. From Israel's point of view, of course, Mark and Naomi described the shock, the human and psychological catastrophe. From a strategic point of view, the idea is that Israel's illusion of complete security has been shattered. My colleague Mark Acker, whom you know well, was telling us how he had visited the Iron Dome settlements in Israel, and how the simplicity of the system can explain why, in a way, it's also very simple to get over the Iron Dome if you put in the resources and prepare for it for a long time. The problem is this land incursion, which was clearly unthinkable for the Israelis. So the illusion of total security, but you still have to find a minimum of security. And I think that's what explains this huge reaction, apart from the obvious idea of revenge, which is perfectly understandable psychologically. From a strategic point of view, we really have to show that Israel has the upper hand. And I think that even the dirty war aspects are part of the game, because we're in a context in the Middle East, in the Levant, and particularly as we've seen in Syria, where all the rules of war have fallen. And so if we want to show that we're strong, we also have to show that we're going beyond the rules of war. I'll leave that open to discussion too, as I think it's perhaps a little polemical. The second point, firstly for Israel, is to restore a semblance of security. The second point is, of course, that until now we've been trying to avoid dealing politically with the Palestinian question. So concentrating on military operations also provides a kind of internal respite for Israel, which is this national emergency government that we know is extremely torn. We had an Israeli speaker who was asked all the questions we're now asking, and he said, look, first we'll get rid of Hamas, then we'll settle the score between us, and then we'll talk to you about the rest. So the second stage is the political recomposition of Israel, and I think that the balance of power in the war being waged has to do with the domestic political balance of power in Israel. And last but not least, Israel needs to count its supporters today. I think that over and above the unconditional support of the Americans, even though we've known for years that Israel has doubts about the solidity of the Americans in the event of a serious blow, in this case, I think we have an American diplomacy that goes to a great deal of trouble. Blinken doesn't count his efforts, and I find them quite subtle. It was a rather complicated start because it was perceived as extremely partisan by all the non-Israeli players in the region. I think that now we've done a very subtle job, but beyond the reflexive support given by the European Union, who are Israel's real friends, and in particular potential friends beyond the Western world. I was in the Emirates, and I found it extremely interesting to see that the country that was the only one to offer Israel condolences after this atrocious attack by Hamas was much more nuanced than I had expected, and that it was still a speech that empowered the Israelis at one point or another. So I think that today Israel is very much on its own, and that we're going to have to restore the Hebrew state's confidence if we want to emerge from this catastrophe.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. Hassan, what are your own views? Let's say from...
What are your points of view? From the Ankara side, but also from a personal point of view, because you know the region very well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here concerning what Hamas did. Hamas did, it wasn't good. So let me start again. Regarding what Hamas did, they shouldn't have done what they did. They need to admit that it wasn't acceptable at all. However, what Israel did too is not good either, especially in Gaza. In Gaza, forcing people to evacuate the area, especially mothers and children. There are far too many dead, far, far too many dead. There's no comparison. I saw the statistics yesterday, and with Ukraine there were 0.27 children killed every day, 0.27 every day. In Gaza it's 136, and the difference between the two is enormous. But when you're wrong twice, it doesn't make a right. And in my opinion, on the Israeli side, we're looking to restore the image, prestige, and power of the state, and rebuild the connection between public opinion, society, and the government, because there's a void between the two. And eliminate Hamas, of course. Then it won't be an acceptable operation for Israel. And ensure that the population can move elsewhere if possible. C. It is a position we're hearing more and more from the government, which has many implications and complications, and above all, control of security in the region, especially in Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and on the Hamas side. In fact, before the attacks, we didn't talk much about what was going on between the Palestinians and Israel. We didn't have a front-page column on it. And Jack Sullivan, of course, was forced to change his article, which had been published in Foreign Affairs and then on everything to do with the international agenda. And this also revealed on the Hamas side, on the Palestinian side, Not everyone is of the same opinion. There are other tensions as well. And once again, the public, the government, they're in the process of separating. And the process will undoubtedly be further exploited in the future at the risk of becoming so. For the Arabs, what we hope is that there will be an awakening on the part of the Arab countries. What's very critical is how they're going to deal with the situation, especially normalization, which I don't think will be reversed. My point of view, and we need to be able to talk about it too, because Hamas has succeeded in getting the Israeli army to penetrate the Gaza Strip. And with very, very difficult operations to conduct in a place like the Gaza Strip, because there are a lot of surprises to be expected. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, the risk of escalation. Is there a risk of escalation? And I'm going to ask the same question of the others. We have, in fact, already seen some signs of escalation. For example, Hezbollah and they've started to address the question of the north, but not a full commitment. And Iran, I don't expect Iran to be too involved. They don't fight. They make the others fight each other in their caucus. So there are attacks that have been eliminated by Saudi Arabia, but also there's a threat to target their oil infrastructure too. So in the event of a regional escalation, there can be quite severe results. But as I said, there are also signs of de-escalation. There are other nations trying to calm things down, some calling for a ceasefire or for the American powers. And Netanyahu doesn't accept ceasefire before the hostages are released. But there are other examples. For example, the number of hostages, the youngest and the oldest could be released. But for example, we could do that, and if it's successful, we could move on. That's how I see a result. There is one critical point. Regional stakeholders are reluctant to get involved. Or certain triggers. What triggers certain actions, and what get them more involved? Yes, so name it. Yes, 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 you can comment, absolutely. And if you can tell us about the escalations within Israel and the Palestinian territories, if you could, if you can. Yes, from a factual point of view, yes. Indeed, today there will be a humanitarian pause of 4 hours. So that's factual to, of course, facilitate humanitarian access. So it's not much, but it's not nothing. As for the ceasefire, I'd like to comment that it's just a question of time before the ceasefire. So from Israel's point of view, it's clear that they'd like to see the hostages released. So we haven't entered into the massacres. It's absolutely atrocious. And if some of you wanted to see, well, there are videos circulating online, and then, of course, there are the escalations. And so the hostages and their release will have a reaction in the streets and between governments too. So what I'm saying is that as the situation worsens in Gaza and the humanitarian situation gets worse if there's no oil and electricity that's allowed into these areas. So, and food. Well, and it's a very, very fine line to change all that. There's a lot of dramatic pressure to try and get a lot more humanitarian assistance. I don't see Egypt and Hassan accepting refugees. No, I don't foresee that at all. You mentioned the possibility, but I think it's going to be a major issue. It will be very complicated to resolve. In Palestine. Yes, Pierre, excuse me, what are you saying? Yes, I was saying that if you think that what we see, if we see the Israeli security forces acting practically every day in the last 6 days to try to avoid the extent of the escalation of this war to the last 6 days, because as you know the situation, what would be your analysis or assessment on that point? Yes, of course, a lot depends on Gaza and how much Israel could contain the provocations of the colonizers and the violence. That's going on there. And with every inflammatory statement that's made, for example, the chief rabbi of the Israeli state has said something quite serious. So it's not enough to say that it's not acceptable, but it should no longer be done, and that's a strong message. And Netanyahu is not able, is not willing, not able is not the right word, and he is not willing to do it because he is afraid that some people will end up in prison. Some ministers and many ministers who make extremely provocative and unacceptable statements should not be in government at all. I believe that if the Prime Minister could act and kick them out, lay them off, that would change a lot. And so there are many Palestinian citizens in Israel, Israeli Jews too, who are working hard to calm the situation. But the government is very extreme, and this extremism won't last. But every day that it remains in power and these ministers remain in power, it endangers the situation, Israel and others. And so until there is a change, so there you have it. In Israel, the protests, and so now there are demonstrations to change the government now, but you have to distinguish between the army and the government. But you have to distinguish between the army and the government. The army has the support of the civilian population and movements, demonstrations, protest movements. But it's they who support them because the government has diverted all the funds to the settlements and the Israeli forces, and it's they who, in fact, This government doesn't work on many levels, but there's food there in the settlements, etc. And so we're going to have to suffer the consequences of a withdrawal. And
I think what's interesting in this situation is that not many people have an interest in escalation, apart from Hamas, in fact, including Hezbollah. In other words, Nasrallah's statements are very ambivalent, both very hot and very fiery against Israel, but with the idea that Israel could force us into war, but not into the desire to go to war. So Lebanon is really under pressure, and that's what's so interesting. It opens up a political perspective because no one has any interest in military escalation, but everyone realizes that the situation is extremely serious. It's true that the information we have today on the aggressiveness of the settlers, on what remains of the Palestinian presence in the West Bank is very alarming, but it's very complicated for Israel, which is waging this absolute war in Gaza, to deal with both fronts at the same time. I think it's extremely complicated to manage this situation finally, while respecting human rights and what international law might require of Israel. First of all, the Palestinians are not a state, so they can't behave as such because they're not a complete state. It's a country where elections are held all the time, leading to increasingly extremist governments which are unraveling as fast as they're being defeated. We can't go on repeating like a mantra that Israel is the only democracy in the region, considering it to be the pillar of regional security, when clearly this democracy has many problems and is not doing well. And I've had a lot of colleagues tell me about their mobilization against Netanyahu's attempted judicial reform and about a real internal debate in Israel, not just about identity politics, as has been the case for so long, since Israeli politics has been hostage to identity issues for a very long time. I'm not going to draw you a picture on the subject of the demonstration against anti-Semitism, which is turning into a kind of complete political pentalonade with, I think, an intervention by the head of state that is incomprehensibly out of step with the times, orient on our Western societies, the United States and Europe.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. That's very true. Mark?
On escalation, obviously, I think that if there's a point where escalation is possible, it's first and foremost the West Bank, because the players are out of control. Unlike the others, this was striking when listening to the long-awaited speech. So Nasrallah's speech, which had been prepared, showed clips with tanks and so on. It was all very martial, etc. But in the end, nothing was said, except that Hezbollah is there, the threat is there.
If I may cut in, there was one interesting sign. The day before, he was caught on video. Nasrallah with his back to Israel on a map with Israel, and his back to the Hezbollah flag, and clearly showing some sort of disinterest in that.
Absolutely. So, from that point of view, there is a rationality. And of all Iran's proxies, the only one who has symbolically intervened and officially declared war on Israel is the Houthi rebellion in Yemen. So we can see that this is a very, very controlled process, But it's still very dangerous because Iran is on a crest line, so they control their proxies. Some of these proxies, starting with Hezbollah, are in a way a deterrent because Hezbollah's military weight, which is far greater than that of Hamas, means that if the northern front lights up, it's complicated for Israel, especially as there's always the other front. So Iran is on this crest line. It wants to show that it's there, but at the same time, it can't totally abandon Hamas either. So it has to find some kind of middle way that allows it to show that it is the leader of Hamas, even if it keeps saying, we had nothing to do with this, it's a 100% Palestinian affair, we approve of it, it's magnificent what they've done, etc., but it's not us, but it's not us. So I think there's another factor, and I'll end on this note, that needs to be taken into account, and which explains why Iran is acting so rationally and not wanting to blow the whistle. As Dorothy said earlier, Iran has already achieved many of its objectives in the region. Then there's another element, which is the nuclear program. Iran's nuclear program, despite the waves of agreements with the United States, has never produced anything very specific. So the nuclear program continues. Iran is already, or is on the verge of becoming, a threshold country, i.e. a country that can have nuclear weapons. Obviously, once Iran has nuclear weapons, the situation will change. In a way, like North Korea, it becomes an untouchable country. There's absolutely no point in Iran waging a war right now where it would be in direct confrontation with Israel and the United States. It would even be totally suicidal and irresponsible in the Islamic Republic's logic. So, for all these reasons, we can imagine that at least on the Iranian side, unless the situation gets totally out of hand in Gaza, with images of huge crowds in the streets, etc., 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 that Iran remains a rational player.
Thank you. Now, I would like to ask you, the both of you, perhaps first to Naomi and then to...
So I'm going to ask Naomi and then Hazen about strategy. So in Gaza, who do you see as a credible interlocutor for the Palestinians and the Israelis? And for example, do you think the idea of an interposition and force for the Arabs? Do you think it's a realistic option or not at all? Yes, thank you very much. First, I'd like to comment on Mark's excellent intervention, just to underline the fact that in talking about escalation and the damage this extremist government is doing, I don't think that, in fact, the West is going to allow colonizations and recolonizations, etc., and the colonizers who are within the government etc. And so for the disputed areas, the Islamists, etc., they've broken the convention, they've broken the rules, they've broken the rules. Broken the rules? They've broken the rules. And the King of Jordan warned that this could lead to an absolute disaster. And nobody listened to Jordan. The implications were unprecedented. And here, therefore, here in France and the West, I think France and the West need to step up and be firmer in their rhetoric and reactions. There was talk of inflammatory rhetoric, and some ministers called for conquer Gaza. That's the last thing Israel wants to do, but it's being interpreted that way. And I think that in all the meetings I have with the Arab states, with all the key players in the region, it's so clear that it's the ones who choose and not on the huge movement that is ending the occupation of the Palestinian territories. And so it's really, you have to understand and set the limits and understand the stakes, because the colonization movement should not have been allowed. This extension should not have been allowed. So it's really an inflammatory strategy. And so I call on those who have a certain influence in the West to really act on this point, because Israel is very divided and the majority of people would like this occupation to end. They want peace, and it's hoped for, and I think it's the same for the Palestinians. Hamas was able to take this action because of these provocations, because they saw that, of course, this Saudi connection with Israel was going to sideline them for good. And so they were forgotten in the peace agreement with Jordan and with the Arab states. So they can't be dropped like that, but they need support. And it's really up to Palestine to support how Gaza should be governed. If, of course, a transitional authority create a transitional authority. Now, who's going to create it? It can be led by Palestine, but it would need help. They need infrastructure. They need to rebuild everything, especially in the north. And I'm not sure about Irebala. You know, that's where there are displaced persons internment. It won't be easy to manage, but I think we need a coalition of Arab states. And you mentioned the Arab League. And it's really up to those states to decide how manage the transition. The UN has done an excellent job on the humanitarian assistance front and the aid. But we need a coordinator for Palestine. There are missions, 5 UN missions in the area. Yes, but very quickly, do you think that Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, and Morocco could come to an agreement? Morocco come to an agreement because they've normalized their relations with Israel? Could they put troops in Gaza, for example, with a view to stabilization? No, I don't think they'll send troops. Egypt occupied Gaza from the years of the war. And so, no, they've managed not to have a single military force there. I don't think you need a military force. I don't think it has to be a military style. No, there are many experiences and models of transitional authorities. You can take the best and the brightest from each model and fine-tune it for each situation. I imagine Saudi Arabia is going to do reconstruction. I imagine that you have the wealthy Gulf states that can help out from that point of view, because the whole Gaza Strip has to be rebuilt. So it depends on the philosophy, the concept. It has to be led by Palestine. The president of Palestine, who has been marked in Gaza, will have to hold elections in Palestine and so on. And the whole community has to support him. So I don't think that on the ground we need military force. And in any case, America will have to intervene. After all, Israel has borders, so you have to have a very good relationship with Israel. So I don't see how we can do this without the key Arab states and the United States in the area. Yes, thank you. I agree in part, in agreement with what was just said a few minutes ago. But as far as reconstruction is concerned, construction in the Gaza Strip, Yes, indeed, what we've seen is the erosion of the prestige and youth of the UN. In fact, the UN Security Council should adopt a resolution that recognizes two independent states with the borders of 1967. That would solve all the issues without military forces on the ground. Once you build trust with the partners, you start to radicalize because, well, there is radicalization on both sides. For example, Netanyahu's reference to the Torah in 2015, or what Ramas looks like psychologically. It's almost the same thing. It's a radical interpretation of religion, and religion should be taken out of the process. It should be a much more protocol-based issue. It should be in line with protocol and not a military force, because that has the danger of complicating the situation. Thank you, Hassan.
To evoke another theme which is related obviously in French, by putting the question to Dorothée, who has just returned from the Gulf region, and then to Mark. These words for you are the Abraham agreements demonetized and frozen, or at least cancelled or just stopped? And is the attempt at normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia dead or just on hold?
So I'm going to merge the two questions at this point. First of all, what I understood from the discussions in the Emirates, and I always thought that the Abraham Accords were a kind of side building, not very effective, but sold to us with an extremely impressive marketing campaign, a major communications offensive by the Gulf states to sell the Abraham Accords to us, especially at the end of the Emirates, is that in any case it will be part of the solution, economically speaking. It's the place where Arabs have succeeded in cooperating with Israel for the first time in a truly effective way on economic and technological issues. It's something the Israelis see as promising as they look for a way out of their regional confinement. So it's very important politically. It obviously didn't solve much, because making peace with a country that didn't even exist at the time of the Israeli-Arab conflicts doesn't make sense. Israel remained at war with Lebanon and Syria, probably hoping that Lebanon would turn into a complete failed state after Syria. So I don't really see how this brought security, being surrounded by two facts. I don't think that the advance agreements have been demonetized. The Saudis, who in the first 3 weeks let the Americans communicate on their behalf, saying no, it's suspended, but it'll be resumed, are starting to give new signs of why une declaration de Mohammed bin Salman, statement by Mohammed bin Salman, is saying that yes, it's important to work with Israel, but we mustn't re-import this Palestinian pillar. So we have to put this Palestinian issue back on the front burner. It remains to be seen how. But I'm waiting for the Saudians to take diplomatic leadership on this issue. I think it's important to go back to the previous exit strategy. It's to put things in an extremely schematic way. First of all, I don't think I saw that Mark was reacting a little to the previous two speakers. I think Israel's security is extremely important. I think we can't neglect at all to say we don't need military forces. I think that if there aren't any external military forces deployed of Arab troops, which is very complicated indeed for political reasons, for any Arab state, that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge question of security for Israel that will absolutely have to be addressed. The case, I think that today the Rama speaks to a community that is effectively a religious community. That's why it has so much impact on opinions in Asia or Africa. it's a religious message that is effectively given, so it's very difficult to get rid of that now, on the other hand. The last few floors, so, of a solution between quotation marks, well, Dion says the right. And I think everyone said it's very important, it's all the more important that the Israelis have refused this right from the start in reality. So if there's something to impose on the Israelis, it's that there's international law. And it's effectively, notably, the question of the settlers, which we've talked about very well, which is absolutely central to this. The problem is that this administration has very little time to work on this issue. We have less than a year to make progress, to lay the groundwork that can even give this democratic administration credibility for the future, because we're not at all sure that we'll end up with a solution to the problem. A third point, the Arab League or the Arab states do have a role to play in the implementation of any agreement, at least in economic terms. That's very clear. So with this aspect of the Abraham agreements, and also politically, to make this agreement acceptable to Arab opinion, that's extremely important. I think there needs to be a deal with the United States, which is the only player Israel can trust to ensure its security. And I would remind you that the Saudi negotiation of the Abraham Accords was also an exchange for a guarantee of American security.
That's exactly what I wanted to come back to. Basically, and this is one of the major changes brought about by the attacks of October 7th, the United States has returned to the Middle East as a major player. But to return to this framework, the question of the UN is not going to be a simple one, because we are in an unprecedented situation where the Security Council is blocked, even more so than it was during the Cold War. Why is this so? Because not only is there a confrontation against blocs which are not as rigid as they were during the Cold War, but which do exist, but above all because one of the permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, has launched a war of aggression in Ukraine, which violates the very principle of the Eschacht. So, can we seriously imagine reaching a compromise in the Security Council for a Security Council resolution, creating this international force capable of putting the Gaza Strip under trusteeship, taking certain models from Cambodia, Kosovo or others, with a country which for the moment has placed itself totally outside international law? It seems a little difficult to me. Are we going to forget everything else on Putin's part and say, well, if it's great, Russia talks to everyone and can be a compromise player? That doesn't seem very likely to me. So we're in a situation where the internationalization of the crisis, on the one hand, and the crucial security guarantees to be given to Israel on the other, seem to me to be squaring the circle at the moment, which means that this crisis is likely to get worse. I wanted to say, thank you, Pierre. Insurance is absolutely important for the state of Palestine.
I just wanted to comment on the fact of
in other words,
security versus the military. Of course, there will be security in relation to a security force. Of course, maybe there's a language problem here between English and French, but 100% agree with security and with Dorothée, what she said. And so, of course,
there was no declaration.
Security is absolutely important for the state of Palestine, and therefore, but perhaps not the army, i.e. Israël doesn't trust the United States unis, mais aussi il faut avoir des membres des États arabes qui travaillent avec eux, et avoir la Ligue arabe, c'est absolument essentiel. Mais le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU est bloqué, et ça va continuer à être bloqué, et nous avons un plan fantastique qui est basé sur la résolution de ce N42. Eh bien, c'est l'initiative de 207, 2007, 2002, 2007. C'était révisé. Et bien sûr, c'était basé sur la ligne verte et sur la ligne de 1967. We're talking about borders, and this was accepted by the UN. And without any shadow of a doubt, this should be the plan, and therefore on which the exit strategy and the reconstruction of Gaza must be based. And this strategy, and now is the time to start implementing the wounded plan. It's now, there's not much that's been done in terms of implementation on any side on the idea there was no declaration. So there were certain little declarations, and then there was a ping-pong match. Yes, Ben Israel, etc. Well, now there will be a big change of government at some point in Israel, and it's true that the US gives a 100% effort at the end of every conflict of this kind, and so, of course, security must be the main issue. Really, colonization is a violation of international law. It should never have happened. It did. And indeed, it's really crossing the green line, and now it must be remedied. But before giving the discussion to the audience, I'd like to go back to the beginning. We're talking about the Med, so I'd like to ask Hassan the question, and then we'll talk about Turkey. And it's like the elephant in the China store, so it's a huge country, and of course the humor, etc. How would you describe the impact today on the Med? Today, the impact on Turkish foreign policy of the war in Gaza on the one hand, and on the other, the recent statement made by your President Erdogan concerning his vision of the region, which has led to different interpretations everywhere else and to you.
I expected the question. But after the elections, there was no change at the time of the discussion nor since. And in the early days of the founding of the Republic, autonomy had to be the watchword, and identity too, and this has continued despite the ups and downs of governments interpreting the text in one way or another. But there is continuity. And as you know, the international system, the global economy, and the economic climate don't always allow us to implement these studies. But what we have observed at this stage is that the strategy is to maintain the balance in the region, because on the Ukraine side there is of course a diplomatic excess. Otherwise, reunion will be a good example, and the Black Sea is another example. There are criticism of the Turkish position concerning the Black Sea, but on our side it didn't go any further than that. We have not witnessed any critical escalation. That said, there was, I would say, a slightly different situation. But as far as Gaza is concerned, from the outset, it's important to know that the President had asked the party to contain itself and to act correctly but with a little control. But of course we lost control. And on the domestic front, there were a number of different demands and points of view. As in Gaza, not to mention the deaths on the civilian side, and the reactions to Hamas only concerned Israeli action on the one hand, and later the statements that were made. Having said that, and for our part, we are observing relations that do not involve normalization with Israel for the time being. Relations are still intact, but the only thing, in my opinion, that exists as long as Netanyahu remains in power, and even if he is re-elected, above all, there will be a presumption that he won't change unless Netanyahu decides to leave and make way for someone else. Someone else. It's personal, yes, it's a question of people. It's a question of people. You can't interrupt relations between the two countries for that. That's not the case. But we need to calm down. International society and the conflict itself need to calm down. I'll stop for the moment.
On this issue,
I wanted to remind you that I believe that this year the Global Firepower Organization lists Turkey as the leading military power in the Middle East region, so this is very important. I immediately wondered about the possibility of an escalation with Israel over the Gaza conflict. I recall that in 2010 it was Israeli special forces that stormed a Turkish civilian ship, 10 years of quarreling. Benjamin Netanyahu's apology to a losing side is one of the things that explains the animosity between the two leaders. They really have had a history of confrontation for 15 years, extremely regular in 2010, 8 at the time of the March of Return to Israel, 8 at the time of the return march to Gaza. Erdogan said that Netanyahu was a terrorist, so Erdogan's line on Netanyahu hasn't budged in the end, and I'm convinced that there's a personal aspect that's extremely important because loser size always personalizes his relations a great deal. Do we have to hope that from one day to the next he'll find himself with the Israeli leader who suits him? That's not how politics is going to work in Israel. It's not just to please the Turkish president. Secondly, I think Turkey is torn between the desire to appear as a responsible power, which became clear, I'd say, after the year 1020, which was the peak of Turkey's difficulties in the Mediterranean, in the CJA, in Libya. There was a real desire on Turkey's part to calm relations once again, to return to a kind of fundamental approach to reconciliation and peace. And this played into the hands of all the countries with which Turkey was having difficulties, including Israel. Turkey is torn between its desire to appear as a positive power, a humanitarian entrepreneur. This is one of the slogans of Turkish diplomacy, but also as a mediating power. In a way, it seems extremely complicated to us today, but politically, it's easier for a country to say yes. Of course, all the Gulf states are on this line. They have very little political discourse on what's happening at the moment, but they're saying it's a humanitarian catastrophe. We all have to be there. We have to intervene. The second possibility for Erdogan is to continue on this line of of the number one supporter of the Palestinian cause, of the hero of the Palestinian cause, who's been playing it since 2008. 2009, he's the only important leader in the region who takes up the cause of the Palestinians and who opposes the Israelis in an extremely vocal, extremely strong way, and it works. It's working because nobody else wants to play that role either, especially not the Gulf states, for example, especially not Egypt, which is obviously under terrible pressure at the moment. So Erdogan has a place to express himself. He's got a place that's just right at the moment in this crisis. He also has this place because he's completely part of the Western camp, because Turkey is in NATO, because it's in business with the European Union on many issues. And so it plays both the role of the Muslim country and the role of the Western country that opposes Israel. And so I think this is really something very important politically for Erdogan, who is a leader who really seizes every opportunity, as we know, and who is extremely skillful at playing the circumstances. Can Turkey play a central role in this crisis? I think the responsibility lies with the Arab countries, but that's not going to stop Turkey from saying from the start of the crisis that we're working on peace solutions, that we need a multiple guarantee system and that we can be part of it. Because if nobody talks politics, well, the Turks have a place to talk politics.
Now, if you don't mind, we're going to move on to questions from the floor, because there are a lot of questions. Unless you want to say something, you have the microphone.
Go right ahead.
Very quickly.
Very, very quickly. Concerning Turkey, Erdogan, as everyone says, he personalizes everything everyone says, so he wanted to be the mediator, he wanted to play a role, and Netanyahu snubbed him, and I just wanted to say that because it's an important thing to say. Thank you, Nomi. And the last word on Turkey for Hassan. We can say a lot. In 2009, in fact, there was a personalization effect, that's for sure. All the same, in trying to normalize relations between Palestine and Israel, an enormous step had been taken, but all of a sudden, without warning, without any information from the Turkish side, the Gaza operation was launched, and that's when he felt betrayed. And a lot has changed since then. We've also seen other problems that tend to persist. But for the time being, who else is going to play the role of mediator for these countries? With their unconditional support for Israel, they've simply sidelined the other countries in the region that aren't that interested. So who's going to make the difference? Who can we identify? Visually?
Turkish diplomacy is extremely brilliant, so there's no doubt that Hakan Fidan, who knows the Middle East best of the whole political spectrum, is the one who will make the difference. East of the whole political spectrum has the cards in his hand to find a solution. Turkey simply has to know where to make itself useful. And I believe that really making itself useful is indeed being a member of the Western camp, including the way Erdogan snubbed Blinken when he came. It's also talking to the United States in a very firm way to show them the limits of their capacity in the region. But I'm certain that Turkey is capable of scaling up its effort. And I know for a fact that what Erdogan regularly says is, I've been betrayed by Netanyahu every time there's an incident. I've been betrayed, there's no trust. Trust hasn't been reestablished with diplomatic relations. The entire Israeli embassy in Ankara was evacuated just a few days after the Hamas operation in Gaza because the Israelis were afraid it was going to happen. Israelis were afraid that things would go badly. So it's not obvious that in the absence of trust, the Israelis will accept Turkey as a mediator. But I have no doubt that Turkish diplomacy has the cards in its hand to work with the Arabs on this issue.
Thank you. I'd like to say a few words before going on to at least two questions, and I'd like to apologize to the public for the richness of the debate. And by the way, I think that in our exchanges, you've had the answer to a certain number of questions that were asked, that were put there on the screen. It's Russia, because there was a question about Russia. As I see it, we're clearly back in a Cold War logic. In other words, we're unrolling. And even though Russia has long tried to have it both ways, to have very good relations with Israel, including economic and political relations, but also with Iran, with Syria, with the countries in the region. Now, however, we have the impression that something has broken, that the Kremlin has realized that Israel is finally turning either to the United States or to certain Arab states with which Russia has complicated relations, and therefore adopts a very harsh tone. This will probably also have repercussions on Israeli action in Syria, because I think it will now be more complicated for the Israeli army to intervene in Syria and even beyond. This brings me to my questions. There was a question basically, could Hamas have been infiltrated by Russia? Personally, I don't think so, but I'd like your opinion. And how do the Russians and Iranians communicate with Hamas? Let me come back to a much more central question. What role should the European Union play in this Israeli-Palestinian war? We'll start with Mark, and then I'll leave you each 3 minutes to give me your opinion on Russia in the region and its infiltration of Hamas, but above all on whether the European Union has a role and what that role should be today in this Israeli-Palestinian crisis.
I agree, colonization is a violation of international law. It should never have happened. But before I give the discussion to the audience, I'd like to go back to the beginning. But before giving the discussion to the audience, I'd like to go back to the beginning.
Thank you, Nomi.
I think that for Russia it's very complicated.
Russia is complicated. And the airport problem in Tajikistan wouldn't have happened without Putin's blessing, for one thing. And secondly, during the meetings between Putin and Kim Jong-un and then the other North Koreans, it's very worrying. And now we need to see Russia's relationship with North Korea's DPRK. Among other things, the more attention we can push elsewhere, and the more American aid will arrive in Israel, the less we'll talk about Ukraine, the less we'll be interested in Ukraine, and especially Putin's side. And we're going to have to keep a very close eye on Putin's current role. I read in the press this morning that the United States had decided to withdraw. Or rather had decided to remove a certain number of military stations on the border with Syria. And there's also a clear statement about the nature of the conflict. It's worrying, and it's very clear. The Israelis know very well where they want to go, where they want to be. And relations with Israel are very complicated because 20% of Israelis have Russian origins. As far as Putin is concerned, very close relations. And as for the EU, all EU member states have their own policies. Given that it's difficult for the Union to reach a high-level consensus, the question is, what can the Union, the European Union, do? Can it put pressure where it's needed to promote peace and get rid of extremism and the problem of escalation we talked about earlier? I don't know if the EU as a political entity is as powerful as its member states. And of course the EU will certainly have to continue its effort with a discourse against inflammatory rhetoric and also colonization. As far as the two shores are concerned, whether in Jordan or Egypt or Lebanon, I think that as far as Hezbollah is concerned, they're hoping they're going to wait. They don't want to get very involved. But at some point, the rhetoric and the actions will speak to each other and it'll be too late. And before that happens, the European Union has to do something behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, and we don't need to know what's being said, but diplomacy will play an important role. But I don't know whether Anthony Blinken, in his private meetings with the Israelis, is a problem or not, or whether there's a door behind which discussions can be held. Door behind which to hold discussions, but for the Union it would be a good start if the Union did that. Next we'll give the floor to Dorothy. Okay, Dorothy. As far as Russia is concerned, I think it holds some very important cards, particularly with regard to the conflict in Gaza and especially the possibility of closing Syrian airspace and the ability to shoot down a lot of aircraft, the possibility of shooting down many Israeli planes and carrying out attacks too. This will give more strength to the players in the region, including Israel, not forgetting the American bases too. We're watching what happens. We've seen that the military posture is softening just a little. Having said that, our president is undoubtedly most interested in strategy, and he'll wait for the right moment before doing anything. But then again, it's all about observing, waiting, and also manipulating information in the journalistic space. And I'd go so far as to say he's even been able to wash himself. clean in Ukraine, and despite what's happening in Gaza, it's an occupation, Gaza, but we don't talk about it. And right now he's taking on a more impartial role. At first it was the United States and the European Union who took center stage. But now we're seeing more impartiality from Russia and China. China, for example, has decided to circulate narratives talking about multipolarity, and above all, they have asked the US Congress for $100 billion to support Ukraine on the one hand, and on our side there was, of course, for China, the possibility of putting $100 billion of investment on the table too. And that was done masterfully. And I think we're going to have to wait for the right moment, and they're going to wait for the right time. Everything will depend on the mistakes made by the West. And I don't suppose you feel like talking about the European Union, so I'll pass the floor to Dorothee.
Actually, I've elaborated. In fact, partially, yes.
In fact, partially, yes, I've elaborated. Yes, 20 seconds, sir. Yes, so I'll give the floor to Dorothee.
Finally, during the Cold War, there was a competition for influence between the United States and Russia with regard to the Arab camp. When the Arab socialists, then we had the Quartet for the Middle East, with the United States, Russia, the UN, and the European Union working together to find a solution. East, we had the United States, Russia, the UN, and the European Union working together to find a solution. Today, we clearly have a Russia that is returning to extremely interesting tactics linked to the war in Ukraine yesterday. We spoke at length about this subject with Igor Delanoue, who is obviously an excellent connoisseur of Russian policies in the region, who told us that Russia has one concern. These republics, which are in the midst of a crisis, are not the only ones. I think that Russia also has another concern, which means that today it is once again in a diplomatic competition for the Gulf countries with both the United States and China, with Saudi Arabia in particular, to be able to manage oil prices, all of which probably means taking a pro-Palestinian stance today. We can't afford to support Israel if we feel that Arab public opinion in the main hydrocarbon-producing countries, is extremely sensitive to the Palestinian cause. So Russia won't do the West any favors on this issue, so we won't have an agreement with the Russians, and what's more, they're obviously a troublemaker, as we've known since the Syrian crisis. We're having a lot of trouble, if you'll pardon the expression, with Russia in every possible military theater, including Libya, where Wagner is involved.
I apologize.
Well, that's done for Russia.
Sorry.
I think we need to talk about China, which is the country I was going to mention that has been the most consistent on the Palestinian question since it began to take an interest. The Gulf countries are in the process of developing their relationship with China, which is very important. So obviously they're hesitating between China and India. They're going to the highest bidder, which interests them the most. But nevertheless, we've seen China establish itself as at least a facilitator between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it's not at all impossible that China would like to play a role in this issue. To play a role in the Palestinian question in the future, so I don't know yet which one I'm going to let Pierre elaborate on the European Union. But I must say that I think we're in a kind of complete psychological depression, because it was the European Union that built the Palestinian Authority, and it was the European Union that financed the two-state solution in Palestine. The two-state solution, or at least the closest thing we've had to it since the creation of the State of Israel. So I think we first have to come to terms with that, because we won't be able to be in the front line at all to Israel and the Palestinians, which puts us in a position, perhaps it's true, to finance at least intellectual efforts to work on a peace plan for the future.
Thank you, Dorothee, for really bringing this roundtable to a close, and thank you all for your participation. I'd like to ask one last question, and I'd like to ask all four of you to give me just a yes or no. Closed question. Perhaps we haven't talked, and it's related to what you've just said, and in particular what Dorothee has just said. Do you think that what happened in August, i.e. the enlargement of the BRICS Plus to include Iran, to Saudi Arabia, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, so this enlargement to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia on the bangs, but above all Egypt. Is this a game changer for the region? Yes, but no. And can this process of BRICS enlargement be called into question? Yes, no, because of the war in Gaza, and we're going in the opposite direction. I'll start with Dorothee.
Yes.
Originally?
I had two questions, Dorothee. So the first one was, is this a game changer? Yes. And can it be called into question by the war in Gaza? No. Right then.
And I'd answer the opposite. No. The BRICS are purely a facade, and yes, it can be called into question by the war in Gaza.
I can't answer yes or no. It's too complicated. It's too complicated. It's a speech, but yes.
Sorry, I think you have the answer there.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me now? Thank you, thank you.
First part, yes. The second part?
First part, yes, and second part, that's a really big question. Thank you very much.
I apologize on behalf of the panelists for the questions we didn't have time to answer, but I still think you've had a lot to answer and think about this morning. Thank you all very much. Bon appétit, and may I remind you that the next roundtable starts at 2:30 p.m.